Okay, so the title of my presentation, How to Build Wealth and Thrive in a World of Economic Uncertainty. So the guys called me up and said, oh, George, we need your title. And I knew that this was a very professional event. So this is the title I gave them, but this isn't really the title of my presentation. The next slide is the title of my presentation. And that is one chart that proves economic collapse is inevitable and how to prepare. A little bit more in line with my YouTube videos. And believe it or not, I'm not being hyperbolic. And we'll get into that in just a moment. But where I want to start is actually explaining how dollars are created, or money in air quotes. And this will help you guys better understand the system, understand a system called the euro dollar. And I'm going to go through a timeline of how we got to where we are today. And then, like I said, I'm going to try to help you guys prepare for whatever we face in the future, in the 2020s. So let's start by looking at some balance sheets. We've got the blue bank, and then we've got the red bank. Okay, so we're going to assume that these banks need to create dollars, but they don't have any to begin with. And so a lot of you, it's kind of a head scratcher. Some of you who maybe might be a little more sophisticated will say, okay, old George, well, they got bank reserves at the Fed. So that's the equivalent, it's a cash equivalent. So they can go ahead and expand their balance sheet. They can create loans, therefore create dollars that didn't exist, because those new dollars, the deposits that are liabilities on their balance sheets, are backed up by the bank reserves that they have at the Fed. Wrong. That isn't entirely true, especially prior to the GFC. And this is how it was done, or is done. So you start off with the banks lending each other $1 million. So how does that affect the balance sheet? We've got the assets on the left, liabilities on the right. So the red bank's assets would be the deposit that they have at the blue bank for $1 million. Their asset would also be the loan, which is the money they lent blue bank. And it's the same thing for the blue bank's balance sheet. Their assets are the deposit that they have at red bank for $1 million. Their asset would also be that loan to red bank. Their liabilities would be the $1 million deposit for red bank, and then the loan, the $1 million they owe red bank. Okay, next step, we insert a non-bank entity. Any of us, the average Joe and Jane, we go in there and say, hey, we need a loan for $1 million. So the red bank says, okay, we can go ahead and do that. So they loan them $1 million. The asset is the loan that was just created. The liability is the $1 million that is now in the non-bank entity's checking deposit or deposit account. So the non-bank entity, and so that part is pretty clear. But where people get mixed up is, well, then what happens if the red bank needs to wire those funds out because they didn't have any to begin with, right? So what happens is the deposit for the non-bank entity, now this is shaded in gray, goes over to the blue bank. And remember, it's for $1 million. So let's also remember that the red bank has $1 million on deposit with them. So the red bank's deposit, the $1 million goes down to a zero. That's their balance. And then the non-bank entities takes its place. So the assets, or the liability side of the blue bank now just has the $1 million deposit from the non-bank entity, and the rest of the balance sheet is the same. And the way that the balance sheet of the red bank changed is they have that new loan for the non-bank entity. Now, I know this gets rather complex, but this is essentially how money is created in the dollar global monetary system by the banks in the euro dollar network. And then what they do is, of course, if they all owe each other $1 million, and they just wipe out the debt, so the only thing that you're left with is the two deposits, the one asset, the $1 million for blue bank, then their liability, which is the $1 million for the non-bank entity, then the red bank, they've got the loan, that's their asset that they lent the money to the non-bank entity in the first place, and then their liability, of course, is the $1 million that the blue bank has on deposit with them. So how many of you understood what I just said? Okay, well, for those of you who are following it, you get it. If you have any questions on this stuff, guys, don't hesitate to grab me after the presentation, and I'm more than happy to explain it further. But I also want to mention that they not only create their own dollars, essentially, they also create their own collateral. So let's go through that process quickly. So we've got, you, the average Joe, you put your treasury in safe keepings with a financial institution, and then we've got a primary dealer that goes to that financial institution and says, hey, I need to borrow that treasury. Okay, so the primary dealer, what they do is they take that treasury and they lend it or they use it as collateral, but it goes into the repo market. And this is just a market for dollar liquidity. And it's overnight. It can be 2-week term repos, what they say, maybe 30 days. So my point here is that treasury can go from the balance sheet of the financial, or well, basically from your balance sheet, to the balance sheet of the primary dealer, to a hedge fund, to a financial institution, back to a hedge fund, and then back to the primary dealer. And this can all happen at the same time. So that one treasury can exist on the balance sheet of multiple financial institutions in the global monetary system. We call this rehypothecation. Has anyone ever heard of that term? Okay, basically we call this a collateral multiplier, and to get your head around how this really works, it's just simply fractional reserve collateral. So you guys know how fractional reserve banking works, where they take on $100 and then they keep $10 and they create loans for the rest. It's the exact same way with collateral, that it's being used multiple times, but it only has one owner. There's far more collateral that exists than is on the actual balance sheets of the individuals who really own the collateral. So the whole point here, if you're not following, is that banking system creates their own money and they create their own collateral. Now, moving on here, let's go to this timeline. I think this will make more sense. We start with Bretton Woods in 1944. That's when the dollar is a reserve currency. Then we go to the 1950s, and up comes the Eurodollar system. Why? Because 60% of the transactions globally were settled in dollars. So if you're a corporation, XYZ in Colombia, let's say, a lot of your input costs are dollars. So if you go to the bank to get a loan, you say, well, I don't need a loan denominated in pesos. I need a loan denominated in dollars so I can buy the stuff I need to produce my widget. The bank says, well, we don't have any dollar deposits. What are we going to do? So finally, these banks get to, they talk to one another and they say, well, listen, why don't we just create these dollars out of thin air through the process that I just described? I trust you, you trust me, so let's just go ahead and do this. We've got all this productive demand for loans. Let's just create these dollars. So this is what happened, and you saw this Eurodollar system grow and grow and grow. And then we get the petrodollar in the early 1970s and mortgage-backed securities in 1968. So what happens to the system that now has figured out how to create their own collateral, create their own money, is they have much more of this collateral, because now all these dollars are going offshore to the OPEC countries that are producing this oil, or all these dollars are going into those OPEC countries from other countries that are buying the oil. So what do with the dollars? They turn around and they buy treasuries. So if they have treasuries now on their balance sheet, that's outside of the domestic economy in the United States, boom, we've got a lot more collateral. And you combine that with the mortgage-backed securities. So what this means effectively is all these banks that are in the Eurodollar system, even if they don't know each other, even if they don't have that relationship, they can continue to expand their balance sheets. They can continue to create these dollars because they have all of this new collateral that has hit the system. So now we move on to 1997, 1998. Something happened called long-term capital management. Went bust. Do you guys remember that? Or have you ever heard of long-term capital management? This was one of the first times where the Fed, or Wall Street, Fed really organized it. They bailed out one of these quote-unquote systemically important funds. So this sends a message of moral hazard to all of the entities globally. They say, well, my goodness gracious, okay, what the Fed is saying is that they're going to back us up. So we can take way more risk and create way more dollars and use that collateral, or increase that collateral multiplier. So we're taking one piece of collateral, maybe we were using it 10 different times before, but now let's just use it 20 different times. Let's use it 30 different times. In fact, let's create all of these derivatives with all of this collateral that really doesn't exist. So we expand our balance sheets, we get more money, more money, more money. Who cares how much risk we take on? Because we're going to get bailed out. I think if we wouldn't have had the bailout of long-term capital management, I don't think we would have had the GFC. I think we would have had a subprime issue, but we wouldn't have had a potential collapse in the entire global economy. So now we go to the GFC in 2008. Like I said, I don't think it was a subprime issue. And another way to think about this is it's like that avalanche that goes all the way down the mountain. Was that avalanche a result of that last snowflake, or was it a result of all the snowflakes that preceded it? Right? I would argue it was all the snowflakes that preceded it. Same thing with the GFC. Another example would be a car that is leaking oil. Well, let's say that car breaks down, the engine seizes because it runs out of oil. Was the problem that it didn't have the oil, or was the problem that it had an oil leak? And this is the exact same thing that I believe happened with the GFC. Because you had a system that was basically completely built on trust and faith. Because there were no dollars. Dollars don't exist. There wasn't any collateral. The collateral doesn't exist to a certain extent. It's all just entries on banks' balance sheets. And they can create as much money, as many dollars, as much collateral as they want. So when the trust was gone, the entire system collapsed. And if you want proof of that, let's go to this next chart, which is the one chart that, in my opinion, proves that economic collapse is inevitable. So this is a chart of bank reserves held at the Fed, going all the way back to, call it 1960, to today's date. And you'll notice from 1960 to 2007, not much happened. Pretty much flatline. So let's think about this. This is one of the main tools that the banks have to create more loans, to expand their balance sheet, to create more dollars. So another thing I want to point out before I move on is in 1987, just to give you an example, the amount of bank reserves in the system was about $60 billion with a B. In 2007, the amount of bank reserves was $40 billion. It went down by $20 billion. What happened to M2 money supply during that time? It went up significantly. We'll get into a couple charts here, but it went from 2.7 trillion up to 7.5 trillion. What was happening with the global economy? It was growing exponentially at a time when the bank reserves were absolutely flat, if not going down. How does that happen? Because it was an expansion of the bank's balance sheets. It was not something that was happening that the Fed was micromanaging. Here's a chart, those two charts of M2 that show those numbers I was just referring to. 87, 2.7 trillion M2 money supply with 60 billion in reserves. 2007, we have 7.5 trillion in reserves with 40 billion. Here is global growth and growth in the United States and Western Europe. Now you'll notice something very interesting. Look at what happened to these lines right about 1940 or 1950. You notice a change? This is specifically because those banks created this free market system of limitless money and limitless collateral. But again, the problem, what is built on trust and faith, and when the government or the Fed came in and organized this bailout, then all of a sudden we had this moral hazard that created the inevitable collapse of the system that was created back in the 1950s to begin with. So this is how I kind of visualize it in my mind. We've got this blue line, which represents those reserves, and we kind of just made it straight so it's easier to visualize. And then we have the free market, which is this system that I was trying to explain. This is going up, and this is happening in the shadows. We really can't see what's going on, but we get an idea because of global M2 money supply or dollar supply, and because of this growth that we see, this economic growth. So we know that behind the scenes, the Eurodollar system is fulfilling the liquidity needs of the global marketplace. So we see this going up and up and up, and then during the GFC or right before, the system breaks. Then it comes down, and what replaced the system? It was the Fed's balance sheet. Right? So those bank reserves go from 40 billion in 2007, they go up to 3 trillion a few years later. They go down a bit, quantitative tightening, and they go right back up to where they are today at 3.6 trillion, but we were over $4 trillion. So how can you sit there and look at this chart and say the system isn't broken? Are you kidding me? Look at this. The whole system was running on $40 billion. Now it needs $4 trillion. So you're telling me that the Fed can reduce the size of its balance sheet to a significant degree? You're telling me that the Fed can normalize everything? Absolutely not, because this system is broken and it's never been fixed. You have to really look at this free market system as though it's FedEx, right? And what's happened is we've replaced that system with central planning. So if the free market system was running this engine on all 8 cylinders, now what we've got is the free market running about 4 of the cylinders, not very well, sputtering, and then we've got the Fed or central planners running the other 4 cylinders. So as you guys know very well, the free market is far more efficient. So what happens when basically the DMV takes over a portion of global dollar liquidity? Well, as you would expect, global growth declines. And that's exactly what we've seen. This is a chart of 10-year averages of growth, real GDP growth in the United States. So we're humming right along, call it 3-4%. Then we get the GFC. It crashes down to, say, 1.5%. And then it continues to go down. Again, this is exactly what you would expect when we have more and more central planning of the global dollar monetary system. So why can't we just keep doing this, George? I mean, you know, we have these crashes or whatever periodically. The Fed comes in, does more and more quantitative easing. The government will come in and deficit spend. No big deal, right? Let's keep kicking the can down the road. Well, this is an example I use on a lot of my whiteboard videos, and I think it'll put things into perspective. The economy is basically a heroin addict, and it's addicted to monetary heroin. That's what we just saw on the Fed's balance sheet. So basically what happens is you've got this economy that crashes like we saw during the GFC. The government comes in, they do all these bailouts. The Fed does quantitative easing, Operation Twist. You know, during the last collapse in 2020, the Fed came in and even set up special purpose vehicles to buy corporate debt. You want to talk about moral hazard, right? So we've got the heroin addict that collapses, like during the GFC, crash, crisis. You know, just laid out on the street. So then the Fed and the government come in, you can see in the first circle, with their monetary heroin. Now this props up the heroin addict so they get up, but they're not at full capacity. They're kind of stumbling around. They kind of look like me and Kenny after about 10 or 12 White Claws, right? You're just kind of like this. But at least it's kind of functioning. Well, then what happens is that only lasts for a while before the heroin addict, boom, collapses again. So the Fed and the government come in just like they did, but now the economy requires more of the monetary heroin, just like a heroin addict needs more and more and more of the drug to have the same level of high. But when they get up this time, after the stimulus, they don't get up to the same level. They're not as, let's say they got up to 80% the first time. Well, the second time they only get up to about 50%. Because again, every single injection of the monetary system distorts the economy even further. It goes back to what we were saying on stage here. When I sit there and talk about quantitative easing, when we talk about locking everyone in a cage as an example, that's why I call lockdowns. When we talk about stimulus checks, when we talk about PPP loans, when we talk about forgiving student debt and all these this government intervention, does this make us, or does this create a system that is going to create more goods and services or less? Less. And if you create less, you have less wealth. I don't care how many currency units you have. Then we get to this last stage where the system collapses the final time. The government comes in with even a bigger heroin needle and says, oh, we came in with $5 trillion of deficit spending last time. Let's do $20 trillion now. The Fed comes in and says, we're going to ride to the rescue. We are doing $120 billion a month in quantitative easing. Let's pump it up to $200 billion a month. We'll do whatever it takes to save the economy. But at a certain point, you've already killed him. He's dead. And no matter how much heroin you put into his veins, he's not coming back. And this is exactly how it works with our economy. So more proof of this is simply government spending as a percentage of GDP. Right? So if we get to 100% government spending of GDP, what does that make us? Communist Russia. That's where the government is in control of every dollar that is spent, for the most part. So in that environment, what does the wealth look like compared to a country like the United States? Let's just go back to the 1950s or the 1960s, right? Were they wealthier in Russia or were they wealthier in the United States? US. Why? Because they could produce more stuff. It's very funny. I'll tell you a quick story. You always see those black and white pictures of communist Russia where they're like standing in line just to buy bread. And we think, my goodness, those people were poor. And we always think that they didn't have money. No, they had plenty of money. The Russians weren't broke. They had plenty of currency units. They had plenty of rubles. There was just no stuff. You see? That's the true measurement. When the government is controlling the means of production, or 100% of GDP, society as a whole is going to be far less wealthy. Our standard of living in aggregate total is going to go down. So look at what happens every single time we have one of these big crisis situations, whether it's a financial crash or a war. You introduced the Fed in 1913, and we're really off to the races, aren't we? Now the government has a piggy bank. So every single time we have one of these situations, you'll notice that the government spending as a percentage of GDP skyrockets, and then it comes down. But it comes down to a level that was far higher than it was before. You see? Going into the last crisis, the COVID deal in 2020, the government spending as a percentage of GDP was right around 40%. Well, when they lock everyone in a cage and they give out all the stimulus checks, my back of the napkin math said that government spending went up to about 55% of our economy. You see? So, in my opinion, when we go into the next recession, how is the government going to respond? The exact same way. But the problem is they're going to have to respond with more and more and more of the drug that killed the economy in the first place, which is going to take the percentage of GDP, or the percentage of government spending as a percentage of GDP even higher. And it goes higher and higher and higher. And this is why I'm very confident that it's not a question of if, It's a question of when. So I'm running a little short on time here, so I'm not going to go into why the Austrians and the Keynesians are wrong on this, but basically it's because we need an entirely new monetary system. But I want to point out to each of you in this room, this may sound scary, but you shouldn't lose sleep over this, because with every huge crisis comes an equally huge opportunity. So now I want to talk about what you can do to not only survive but thrive the 2020s and a potential financial storm that I think is on the horizon. First, you need to educate yourself. And this starts with knowing what you don't know. You guys have taken a great step by coming to this conference in the first place. A good example of this is when I retired in 2012. This was one advantage that I had. I knew that I didn't know anything. I didn't know what the Fed was. I didn't know what the bond market was. I didn't know what a yield curve was. Absolutely zero. But I wanted to manage my own money. So I got out there and I watched every single YouTube video I could. I listened to the podcast. I read the audiobooks. I did everything to educate myself. But I was always looking in the mirror with humility, never with an ego, always asking myself, what don't I know and what do I need to learn? And as a result, I was trying to figure things out. I stumbled across Jim Rogers. I came up with this kind of mantra, that he always talked about. We just buy things when they're cheap, sell them when they're expensive. So I was fortunate to buy a lot of real estate in 2012 after I educated myself. And as you guys can see by this chart, that worked out well. Okay, the next thing you need to do is have an edge. There's a lot of real estate investors in here and a lot of entrepreneurs. What do you know that your competition doesn't? What makes you different? Right? You can sit there and say, well, George, I do this or this or this. Well, really? Is Kenny McElroy not doing that? So you got to ask yourself, what can you do to beat your competition? So a good story here is the YouTube channel that I set up in 2019. I had just taken a break from doing a TV show in Medellin, Colombia. It was like an HG TV show. And I was the executive producer. So I had all these editors, all these camera people at my disposal. I wanted to put them to work. And my payroll for producing these YouTube videos with all these editors I had, because labor is so cheap there, was about $5,000 a month. And I said, aha, this is my edge. Why was this an edge? Because in order to produce the type of content or the amount of content that I was producing at the beginning, the quality of content, you have to have a fleet of people. And I knew that to hire that fleet of people in the United States, it would probably cost you $40,000 a month. And I also knew that when you make these YouTube videos, the only people who are watching them are your mom and your sister. And so there's no return whatsoever. So I'm able to do this, have a loss leader of $5,000 where most people would have to spend $40,000. Very few people would be willing to do that. That was my edge. As a result, you look at October 2022, I just started posting videos maybe 2 or 3 months prior to this. And the whole entire channel was doing about 40 views per day. 40. All the videos combined were doing about 40. About 3 weeks later, they were doing 70,000 a day. This is a direct result of having an edge. And it's an edge that I've been able to maintain in this YouTube space to today, and I think I'll be able to maintain it into the future as well. Lastly, you have to build a network. And I'm going to do my very best to share with you guys a very difficult story. It was the hardest time in my life. And, well, maybe I should start by asking you, how many of you have been poor in your life before and you've improved your standard of living? A lot of us. How many of you have been poor, made a lot of money, you got rich, but then something happened and you went back to being poor? A lot less. For those people who have done that, how difficult was it? It was excruciating. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. Back in 2009, I lost everything. Everything I had. It wasn't because of GFC. It was because I got in a big legal battle with an AG, and that's when I realized that politicians have a lot more power and control than I do. So I went from living in the $2 million condo driving the Lamborghini to living in the ghetto, just trying to figure out where I'm going to come up with the money for the next round of payroll. And it didn't happen slowly. I lost that money, everything I had pretty much, within a matter of about 2 months. So this puts me in a mind space where I hate to use the word depressed, but I was in a very, very, very bad place. So in order to kind of clear my thoughts, I went up to one of my favorite places in the world, which is Moab, Utah. And I really like getting out there and hiking and just, turning off the cell phone, just getting it away from people and just thinking, what am I going to do? Everything was going through my head. This life is unfair. Why should I try to make this money back again? I've got this great excuse. It wasn't my fault. So I've got this great excuse for just hanging it up and just being poor for the rest of my life, which is where I started, right? All these thoughts are going through your head. I got out to this cliff face that was about 1,000-foot drop, okay? And this is all sandstone, and on the side of this cliff, there was an incline that was about maybe 20 or 30 feet wide, right? So I wanted to get to the top. And I saw this massive drop-off. I was standing about right here. I thought, well, that's not too steep. I can just kind of walk up and then just get up to the top and then keep on with my journey, right? Well, I'm no rock climber at all. And what happened is I went out about halfway onto this face and I started sliding. The rock face was far steeper than I had anticipated. And in about 2 seconds, it dawned on me that I couldn't get to the top. But it also dawned on me that I couldn't get back to where I started. They call this being rim-rocked. I was gradually sliding toward this 1,000-foot drop. Very similar to this guy in the picture. But I was on an incline that was obviously less steep. And so I was able to grab onto a little crack in the sandstone to stop the slide from continuing. And in a split second, 30 seconds prior, I was on the ledge, no problem. And it's just this bizarre feeling where it just hits you like a ton of bricks that I'm most likely going to die in maybe 2 or 3 minutes. So I thought, what can I do? I looked at my cell phone. I was in the middle of nowhere. There's no reception. I'm not on a trail. I'm miles away from the parking lot. I had been walking for hours. So I thought to myself, the only thing I can do is just yell for help. So I started yelling, "Help! Help! Is anyone out there? Can you hear me?" And the feeling got even worse when all I heard was the echo off the canyons. And you just kind of realize how alone you really are. And then I was even thinking to myself, well, if I could somehow get reception, I could call. But then I'm like, wait a minute. I've only got about 2 or 3 minutes. There's no way a helicopter can get here that fast. So I continued to yell for help. Finally, and it's an absolute miracle of God, I heard someone respond. They said, "Yes, I'm here." But I could only hear a distant echo. So I didn't know how far he was. Or if he could help me, once he got there. And so I said, okay, well, I've got to up the urgency here. So I said, I'm here. I said, again, help. And I said, I don't know how much longer I can hang on. Because at this point, I was going from one arm and it would start shaking like this, and I'd have to switch to the other arm until it would start shaking just to stay on this cliff face. So I don't know what it was, maybe a minute, 2 minutes. I mean, it felt like an absolute eternity. But I looked up and I saw the guy standing up there. The kid was maybe 20 years old, but you could tell he was a professional. I mean, he had all the ropes, all the little hooks and everything. And as soon as he saw me, I saw him just immediately go over there, bam, 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 bam. He tied himself to this, he secured himself, and he came, just scaling down the side of this cliff. And as soon as he got to me, he had an extra rope on there. He just swings it around my arms, just grabs it like that, attaches it to his belt so I wasn't going anywhere. And I'm basically hanging like this. So then, obviously, I mean, the adrenaline is absolutely through the roof. I was basically on the brink of a heart attack. And the guy was able to get me down to the ledge where I started. And, he was kind of happy-go-lucky. I mean, what do you say to the person, right? I'm like, dude, you saved my life. It's like, oh, it's nothing. You would have figured out a way around that. I'm like, no, I wouldn't have. And so we talked for a bit, we exchanged emails, and I was obviously just thanking him over and over and over again. And in Moab, Utah, at night, everyone meets at kind of like the local bar there, the Moab Brewing Company. So I knew that he wouldn't take anything, 20-year-old kid. So I went out to the ATM. I just took out as much money as I possibly could, that the ATM would allow me. I think it was a couple grand or something. And I left it for him at the front in an envelope, because I knew if I gave it to him in person, he probably wouldn't take it. So fast forward about 2 months, and I get an email from the kid. And he said, I just wanted to reach out and thank you. I didn't tell you when we were on the cliff face, but the reason I came down to Moab with my girlfriend is because we were broke. And we were at our wits' end, and we just came down there to think about what we were going to do next. And because of that $2,000 you gave me, we were able to pay the rent, and it bought us enough time to where I could get a job and we could get back on our feet. So I personally believe that God intervened in both of our lives and brought us together at that time for pretty much the same reason. And if you go back to that cliff face when the kid left, I'm walking back down, I go from a state of panic to a complete state of euphoria. And as I'm walking down, I'm actually angry with myself for being depressed in the first place. Like, what are you doing? How on earth can you be in a negative mental state? You just lost money. Who cares? I don't care how crooked the politicians are. At the end of the day, they can't take away from us what is most important. Right here. I still got this. I still got my brain. So if I can be honest and forthright with you guys, I started having a pretty intense conversation with myself. Saying, listen, you have had a loser mentality. Loser mentality. I said, you need to grab your fucking balls right now, get back on the saddle, and start kicking some fucking ass. But there was a problem. I was grabbing my balls, but I was still broke. So what did I do? I reached out to my network when I got back, and I just had a heart-to-heart conversation with two people that I had known for a long, long time. And because I had provided value to them in the past, we knew each other, we trusted each other, we were part of the same tribe. These guys were able to give me a cash infusion that allowed the business to survive. It gave us a runway. And over the next 2 years, or up to 2012, I was able to not only make the money back, but make way more than I had to begin with. And then, as you guys know, I retired. But I wouldn't have been able to bridge that gap if I wouldn't have had that network. So this is really what I want to encourage you to do. I mean, you guys have made a great start right now. But whether it's your local community, whether it's a mastermind, I think the real magic is taking that network that you have, expanding it, because at the end of the day, you're only the average of the 5 people that you spend the most time with, right? So you want people that will have your back, especially if you have a financial storm coming our way, right? You want to add value where they can depend on you and you can depend on them. Like I said, the magic is when the network becomes the community and the community becomes your tribe. That's what I want to encourage all of you to strive for. In closing, I got a text from my good friend Robert Kiyosaki yesterday. And we were going back and forth, and I asked Robert to really help me out. I was in a bind. Wasn't on a cliff face, but I was on a bind, or I had a bit of a bind. I said, hey, man, could you help me out? Could you do a couple things? And he said, absolutely no problem. And I texted him back, thank you very much. I appreciate it, Robert, as always. And he texted me back 2 words, Semper Fi. That's right, baby. This is a Marine saying. What does it mean? Always faithful, always loyal. You want people in your life right now that are always going to be faithful, they're always going to be loyal. So I want to encourage all of you right now. This is your cliffhanger moment. You're right where I was when I was looking at that cliff and completely oblivious as to my downside risk. You've got to have an edge. You've got to know what you don't know. You've got to build this network. Because when you walk out to that cliff face, you're either going to slide off and go all the way down 1,000 feet, or you're going to take those skills, that tribe that you've built, and you're going to climb a mountain. The choice is yours. Thank you very much.